Vreth had archived wars before, hundreds of them, border disputes between the Shale and the Torvan that lasted centuries, the Ul harmonic collapse, the third Noxus expansion. He had catalogued weapons that could crack moons and plagues that could erase entire biomes from a planet's surface. None of those files carried a black cipher. This one did. He turned the data crystal in his forelimbs, clicking his mandibles in the way his species did when something refused to make sense. Council Directive 4 Sigma 9. Threat Classification, Nova Equivalent. The same level reserved for unstable stars and self-replicating weapon swarms. The subject of the directive was noise, or rather, the absence of it. Vreth set the crystal into his console and began pulling records from the beginning, because that was where things were supposed to make sense, even if they rarely did. Humans had joined the Galactic Compact 30 standard years ago, a short time by most species' reckoning. The Kethali had been members for 11,000 years, the Shale for 8,000, the Torvan for 6. Humanity was still the new arrival, still being studied, still being measured, and measured, and measured again, because the measurements kept coming back wrong. Not wrong in the way that meant broken instruments, wrong in the way that meant the instruments were working fine, and reality was the problem. The first thing every species noticed about humans in combat was the noise. Vreth pulled up early joint exercise recordings from the integration period, when human military units first trained alongside galactic forces. The audio alone was overwhelming. Humans screamed when they charged. They shouted coordinates, warnings, insults. They roared when they were hit. They cursed, a linguistic phenomenon Vreth had written a separate paper on, with a creativity that bordered on artistic. They cheered when they destroyed a target. They whooped. They hollered. One recording from a joint exercise on Pellis 4 showed a human marine singing while laying suppressive fire. Singing. The Shale Dominion, who fought in telepathic silence so absolute that their battlefields sounded like empty rooms, had filed a formal complaint. They called it auditory pollution, and requested that humans be fitted with vocal dampeners during combined operations. The Torvan hegemony, who coordinated through subsonic clicks below the hearing range of most species, had been less diplomatic. Their assessment read, humans broadcast their tactical intentions, emotional state, and unit cohesion through open vocalizations. This represents a fundamental failure of combat discipline and a critical vulnerability to any opponent capable of audio interception. The Ul Collective, who fought in harmonic resonance, each unit humming a frequency that meshed with the whole, creating a kind of combat song, had been the most generous. They described human battle noise as a crude but functional resonance analog. Coming from the Ul, that was practically a compliment. Everyone agreed on the conclusion. Humans were loud because they were undisciplined. The noise was a weakness, an exploitable tell. If you could hear them, you could find them. If you could read the tone of their voices, you could gauge their morale. If you could isolate their communications, you could predict their movements. Several species had tested this theory. The Torvan ran models. The Shale attempted signal interception during border incidents. A Noxus raider clan even developed what they called scream mapping, a tactical system that tracked human vocalizations to predict squad movements and target officers by identifying command voices. The results were consistent and frustrating. The theories were sound, the models were elegant, and in actual engagements, they failed. Not catastrophically, just enough to be useless. Humans were loud, yes, but the noise was not as predictable as it seemed. They shouted false coordinates for fun. They screamed in pain and kept fighting. Their emotional tenor bore no reliable relationship to their combat effectiveness. A unit that sounded panicked would execute a perfect flanking maneuver. A unit that sounded confident would fall back in deliberate retreat. The noise was not signal. It was something else entirely. Or rather, and this was what the Council's own analysts eventually concluded, the noise was signal, but not the kind that could be decoded tactically. It was social signal. Humans were not communicating information through their shouts. They were communicating presence. They were telling each other, I am here. I am alive. I am still in this fight with you. The screaming was not a failure of discipline. It was the glue holding the discipline together. Vreth found this mildly interesting in an academic way. Humans were social pack predators with an overdeveloped communication system. Fine. Many species had quirks. The Torvon ate their dead to honor them. The Ool could not function as individuals and went catatonic if separated from their collective for more than a few hours. The Kethali, his own species, had a genetic compulsion to archive everything, which was why he was sitting in this chamber at an unreasonable hour reading about screaming apes. Every species was strange. So what? He almost closed the file. Then he found the incident report from Relay Station Korath 7, and the black cipher suddenly made much more sense. The report was filed 14 years ago by Shale Commander Urith, a career officer with 60 years of combat experience across multiple theaters. Urith was not given to exaggeration. His service record was a study in calm, measured assessment. His after-action reports read like equipment manuals, precise, emotionless, comprehensive. The Korath 7 report was different. Vreth noticed the difference in the first line. Urith had not used the standard Shale military header. He had begun with a personal statement, which in Shale culture was the equivalent of a human officer beginning an official report by grabbing the reader by the collar and saying, "Listen to me." The statement read, "What follows is a complete and accurate account of the events at Relay Station Korath 7. I have reviewed my own testimony for bias and found none. I understand that my conclusions may appear extreme. They are not. The Council must read this in full. The Council must understand what human silence means." Vreth's mandibles stopped clicking. He leaned closer to his console and opened the full file. Relay Station Korath 7 sat at the edge of nothing useful. A joint human-shale outpost bolted onto an asteroid in a system that mattered only because Noxus raider clans used the surrounding space as a highway. The garrison existed to watch, report, and hold long enough for reinforcements if something went wrong. Something went wrong. Commander Urith's report began with numbers. 3,000 Noxus dropped out of faster-than-light travel in a staggered formation designed to cut off retreat vectors before the garrison even knew they were there. Against them, Korath 7 held 160 Shale soldiers and 40 humans, 200 total. The math was not complicated. It was also not survivable. Urith ordered the distress signal sent and began organizing a defense. He expected to hold for perhaps 2 days, maybe 3, if the Noxus were cautious. Long enough, he hoped, for a fleet to respond. The humans had other opinions about the timeline. Sergeant Mara Okonkwo commanded the human platoon. She was 31 years old, built like she had been assembled from spare parts that did not quite match, and possessed a voice that could carry across a vacuum through sheer willpower. When Urith briefed her on the situation, 3,000 enemy, no reinforcements for days, probable overrun, she looked at him and said, "So, we're going to be famous." That was the last calm moment for 5 days. The Noxus hit the outer ring on day 1 with probing attacks. Standard Raider doctrine. Find the weak points, test the response, map the defenses. What they found was that the Shale held positions with silent telepathic precision, covering every angle, giving nothing away. And the humans screamed at them. Okonkwo's platoon held a section of the eastern perimeter, and from the moment the first Noxus breacher cut through the hull plating, the audio feed from their sector was a wall of sound. Soldiers shouting target locations. Okonkwo bellowing orders that somehow made tactical sense, despite containing language that would have made a dockworker flinch. A corporal named Davis singing, actually singing, something about a river and a valley every time he reloaded his weapon. The Shale found it grotesque. Urith noted in his report that during days 1 through 3, several Shale officers requested reassignment away from human-adjacent positions because the noise was interfering with their telepathic coordination. Urith denied the requests. He did not explain why at the time. Later, in his testimony, he admitted the reason. The noise helped. He could not quantify it. He could not explain it in terms the Shale Military Academy would accept. But the sound of 40 humans treating a desperate siege like a bar fight they intended to win gave his 160 Shale something that telepathic silence could not. It gave them the irrational belief that the situation was survivable. The humans sounded like they were having a terrible, violent, wonderful time. And that energy was contagious in a way Urith had never experienced and could not replicate. Day 2 was worse. Day 3 was worse than that. The Noxys pushed harder. They breached secondary bulkheads. They flooded corridors with gas that burned Shale chitin and made human eyes swell shut. Okonkwo lost 6 soldiers. She announced each death over the comm with a curse and a promise that was specifically and anatomically directed at the Noxys species. The surviving humans fought harder after each one. Then day 4 came, and the Noxys breached the eastern habitat ring. The fighting went close, corridor to corridor, room to room, the kind of combat where you could smell what the enemy had eaten and where the distance between you and death was the length of your arm. Okonkwo's platoon was in the center of it. Urith monitored their comms from the command hub, tracking their positions on a tactical display that kept losing signal as relay nodes were destroyed. They were still loud. Okonkwo was still commanding. Davis was still singing between bursts of fire. A private named Kowalski was narrating her own actions, like a sports broadcast. A habit Urith had been told was a coping mechanism, though it sounded more like madness. On day 5, the Noxys prepared their final push. Every remaining raider converged on the eastern ring. Urith watched his display and understood that the 40 humans, now 31, were about to be hit by a force that outnumbered them 40-1. He opened a channel to Okonkwo to order a retreat to defensible positions. The channel was open. He could hear breathing. He could hear footsteps. He could hear the distant, wet sounds of violence echoing through metal corridors. No voices. Urith called again. Sergeant Okonkwo, report status. 3 seconds of nothing. 5 seconds. Then Okonkwo's voice, flat as a sheet of hull plating. No inflection, no heat, no personality at all. Still here, Commander. Don't worry about us. Urith had served for 60 years. He had heard soldiers lie about their condition. He had heard bravery and cowardice and everything between. He had never heard a human voice sound like that. It sounded like someone had taken Okonkwo's personality out of her body and left only the parts that knew how to kill. He ordered a Shale squad to reinforce the eastern ring. They entered the corridors and came back 14 minutes later. The squad leader, a veteran of 30 years, refused to return. When pressed, he said only, "The humans do not need help. The humans need to be left alone." For 6 hours, the comms stayed silent. Urith tracked the humans on his tactical display and watched something he could not explain. 23 humans, cut off, outnumbered, cornered in a shattered habitat ring full of Noxys raiders, moved through those corridors without speaking a single word to each other. They did not retreat. They did not hold. They advanced. They moved like water through cracks, splitting and merging without coordination signals, appearing behind enemy groups that had no warning, collapsing Noxys positions with a speed and brutality that his tactical computer kept flagging as anomalous, because it could not match the movement patterns to any known human doctrine. There was no doctrine. There was no plan. There was something older than plans operating in those corridors, and it did not need language. In 6 hours, 23 silent humans killed over 400 Noxus. They retook the entire Eastern Ring. They sealed the breaches. They fortified positions. When the relief fleet arrived 18 hours later and breached through to the Eastern Ring, they found the humans sitting among the dead. Some were shaking. One was eating a ration bar with hands so steady they might have been carved from stone. Kowalski was staring at a wall. Davis was holding his weapon across his knees with his eyes closed. Okonkwo looked up at the relief team. Her face was blank. Then something shifted behind her eyes, like a machine switching off and a person switching on. "Took you long enough," she said. Then she laughed, and Davis opened his eyes and started swearing, and Kowalski turned from the wall and began narrating the rescue like a sports broadcast, and the noise came back, filling the corridors, filling the dead spaces between the bodies. The humans were loud again. Yuriath ended his report with a single paragraph that Vreth read 3 times. When the humans are shouting, they are fighting. They are soldiers. They are afraid, brave, angry, and alive. They operate within the framework of their training and their humanity. When the humans fall silent, they have stopped fighting and started killing. The words are not the same. I did not understand the difference before Korath 7. I understand it now. I recommend the Council learn this difference before it costs us. The Council did what the Council always did when confronted with something it did not understand. It formed a committee. The committee hired an expert. The expert spent 3 years producing a report that most Council members skimmed, and none of them fully believed. The expert was Dr. Luentha, a Torvan xenopsychologist who had spent her career studying how different species processed violence. She had published widely on the Shale telepathic combat trance, the Ul harmonic dissolution effect, and the Noxus raider species' neurological addiction to conflict. She was, by every measure, the most qualified person in the galaxy for this work. She was also, by her own later admission, completely unprepared for what she found. Vreth opened her research files and settled into his reading posture. Dr. Luentha's work was meticulous, thorough, and deeply, quietly horrified. She began with the obvious question: why were humans loud in combat? The answer, she discovered, was not cultural. It was not trained. It was biological. Humans focalized under stress because their neurology demanded it. The act of shouting released specific chemicals in their brains that regulated fear, sharpened focus, and reinforced social bonding under pressure. A human who screamed in battle was not wasting energy. They were running a chemical regulation program that kept their higher brain functions online and operational. The shout told the brain, "You are part of a group. The group is fighting. You are a member of the group. You will behave as the group expects. You will follow rules. You will distinguish friend from enemy. You will hold." Dr. Luentha described this as the vocal leash, a self-regulating system that kept the human mind tethered to its social identity during extreme stress. As long as a human was vocalizing, they were operating within the boundaries of their training, their morality, and their awareness of self and others. This was not a weakness. This was, in Dr. Luentha's words, one of the most elegant combat regulation systems in known biology. Then, she addressed the silence. She studied the Korath 7 data. She reviewed 7 additional incidents that had been flagged in the years since. Smaller engagements, border skirmishes, a hostage rescue on a Noxus slave ship, where human units had gone silent under extreme duress. In every case, the pattern was the same: noise, 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 then nothing. And in the nothing, something changed. She requested access to human military psychological research. The humans gave it to her, all of it. They held nothing back, which surprised her. Later she understood why. They wanted someone else to understand what they already knew. The human military had a term for it. They called it the drop. Dr. Luentha described the drop in clinical language. But even filtered through Torvan academic style, the description was unsettling. Under sufficient stress, when losses mounted past a certain point, when the situation became desperate enough, when the threat was total and escape was impossible, the human brain could undergo a rapid reorganization of priorities. The vocal regulation system shut down. The social identity framework, the part of the mind that said, I am a soldier, I have rules, I belong to a unit, I am a person, went offline. What remained was older. Much older. Humans were predators, this was known. But what the galactic community had failed to understand was how deep that predator architecture went. Beneath the civilization, beneath the training, beneath the language and the morality and the rules of engagement, there was a system built over millions of years of evolution that had one function: survive and eliminate the threat. Not defeat, not repel, eliminate. The drop activated this system. Dr. Luentha was careful to distinguish this from what humans called berserker rage, a phenomenon that appeared in their own mythology and history. Berserkers were loud. Berserkers were uncontrolled, burning through energy, in a frenzy of aggression. Berserkers burned out fast and were relatively easy to counter because they were predictable. Silent humans were the opposite. They became calm. Their heart rates dropped, their breathing slowed, their fine motor control improved, their reaction times shortened to the lower limits of their species' biological capability. They processed spatial information faster and shared situational awareness with nearby humans through means Dr. Luentha could not fully explain. Micro-expressions, body positioning, breath timing, some form of subconscious coordination that operated below the level of language. They became, in effect, a pack of apex predators operating on pure instinct with the benefit of 10,000 years of accumulated combat knowledge baked into their training. This was the terrifying part. The training did not go away. The skills did not vanish. The tactical knowledge remained. What disappeared was the restraint that normally governed how those skills were applied. The rules of engagement, the moral framework, the part of the brain that said this one is an enemy, but that one is an ally, and this amount of force is enough, and that target is not a combatant. A silent human would not attack an ally intentionally, but a silent human's ability to distinguish ally from enemy was degraded. Not gone, degraded. In the chaos of close combat, degraded was enough to be dangerous to everyone in the room. Dr. Luentha interviewed human military psychologists and was struck by their openness about this. They did not deny it. They did not minimize it. They called it the oldest monster in the room and said that every piece of human military training, every ritual, every tradition of unit cohesion and battle cries and war songs and shouted orders existed in part to keep that monster contained. The noise was not a byproduct of combat. The noise was the cage. One human psychologist, a major whose name was redacted in the file, told Dr. Luentha something that she included verbatim in her report because she felt the phrasing carried meaning that paraphrasing would lose. The major said, "Every human being carries something inside them that is very good at killing. We spend our whole lives building systems to keep it asleep. Language, community, love, rules, morality, music, all of it, every piece of civilization we have ever built, is partly a lullaby for the thing that sleeps in our hindbrain. When we are shouting in a fight, we are still singing the lullaby. When we go quiet, it means the song has stopped and the thing has woken up. Dr. Luenta ended her report with 3 recommendations. The first was that human combat vocalizations should never be suppressed, dampened, or interfered with by Allied forces. The shale complaint from the integration period should be permanently rejected. Silencing humans in combat was not a courtesy, it was a hazard. The second was that any Allied species operating alongside human forces should be trained to recognize the onset of silence and understand its meaning. The silence was not defeat. The silence was not calm. The silence was the sound of the most dangerous thing on the battlefield, shedding its restraints. The third was the recommendation that became Directive 4 Sigma 9. She wrote, "The Council must understand that human noise is not the threat. Human noise is the leash. When the leash comes off, you do not want to be in the room. You do not want to be in the corridor. You want to be far away and quiet, and grateful that whatever those humans are hunting, it is not you." Vreth saved the file and sat in the silence of the archive chamber. He was beginning to understand the black cipher. But understanding, he was learning, did not make the understanding any less uncomfortable. He still had 2 more files to review. The next one was marked with a date from 3 years ago, and when he opened the header, he recognized the location. The Vathani corridor. He had been there. His mandibles began clicking again, and this time they did not stop. Vreth did not need the file to remember the Vathani corridor. He had been there. He had been 23 years old by Kethali reckoning, fresh out of the academy, assigned as a junior sensor officer aboard the Kethali frigate Whisper of Catalogs. It was supposed to be a routine convoy escort through a nebula passage. Dense gas clouds, poor sensor range, heavy trade traffic. The kind of assignment they gave to new officers so they could practice reading instruments without anyone getting killed. The Noxus had other plans. The Coalition fleet was a typical joint force, 60 ships from 4 species, human, shale, Torvan, and Kethali, escorting a convoy of 40 civilian transports carrying roughly 40,000 souls, colonists, merchants, families. The fleet was commanded by Admiral Torvan Guess, a veteran of the border wars, old enough that his scales had gone from green to gray, and experienced enough that nobody questioned his command, despite the Torvan tendency to be cautious to the point of paralysis. The Noxus Armada dropped out of FTL across 3 vectors, boxing the convoy inside the corridor. Over 100 raider ships, fast, heavily armed, crewed by a species that experienced combat the way other species experienced narcotics. The Noxus did not fight for territory or resources or ideology. They fought because fighting was the only thing that made their neurology feel complete. Guess assessed the situation in 4 seconds and ordered a fighting retreat. The convoy would run. The math was ugly but workable if they moved fast and sacrificed the rear. The human contingent volunteered for the rear before Guess could assign it. Captain Elena Vasquez commanded the human destroyer Achilles and its 2 escort corvettes, the Argonaut and the Myrmex. 3 ships, 900 crew total, against 100+ Noxus raiders. Vreth remembered pulling up the human comm channel on his sensor console. He was supposed to be monitoring gas density readings and scanning for flanking formations. Instead, like every other junior officer on every other Allied ship, he was listening to Vasquez. She was extraordinary. Her voice on the open channel was alive with something Vreth had no Kethali word for. A frequency of energy that was simultaneously terrified and joyful and furious and absolutely certain that the universe would bend before she did. She called out maneuvers in a mix of standard tactical language and profanity, so creative that the translation software kept flagging errors. She coordinated her 3 ships with a precision that made the Torvan tactical AI look slow. She taunted the Noxus on open frequencies, challenging specific ships, calling their captains by sensor profile because she did not know their names and it did not matter. For 2 hours, 3 human ships held the corridor open behind the retreating convoy. The Achilles took hit after hit and kept fighting. The Argonaut lost its port engine array and flew in spirals that somehow became tactical advantages, because Vasquez wove them into her patterns. The Myrmex, the smallest ship, darted through Noxus formations like an insect that was too angry to die. The humans were loud. The comm channel was a symphony of shouting and laughter, and the particular sound humans made when they knew they were going to die and had decided to be offended about it. Then the Noxus concentrated fire on the Argonaut. Vreth watched it on his sensor display. The Argonaut took 11 direct hits in 40 seconds. Its hull integrity dropped to 0 in stages. 80%, 60, 40, 20, and then it was gone. Not slowly, not gracefully. The ship broke apart, and its 200 crew became heat and light and expanding gas. The Argonaut's captain was a woman named Torres. Vasquez had served with her for 9 years. Vreth remembered the exact moment on the comm channel. Vasquez was mid-sentence, calling a maneuver, her voice sharp and electric. The Argonaut disappeared from the sensor display. Vasquez stopped talking. The channel stayed open. Vreth could hear the bridge of the Achilles. He could hear consoles, breathing, the hum of systems running hot. No voices. 14 seconds of nothing. Then Vasquez spoke. One sentence. No inflection. No heat. A voice like a flat line on a medical monitor. Myrmex, form on me. That was all. No grief, no rage, no acknowledgement of 200 dead. Just a tactical instruction, delivered in a voice that had been emptied of everything that made it human. Admiral Guess heard it too. Vreth watched the old Torvan scales shift color, a stress response. Guess opened a private channel to his aide and said 4 words that Vreth's console picked up, because it was monitoring all fleet communications. They've stopped talking. Then Guess ordered every coalition ship to widen the retreat corridor by 3 kilometers on either side of the human ships. His aide questioned the order. Guess did not explain. He repeated it, and there was something in his voice that ended the discussion. What happened next was recorded by long-range sensors across the fleet. Vreth watched it from his console. He had watched it again 100 times since. It still did not make sense to him in any way that his training could accommodate. The Achilles and the Myrmex stopped retreating. They turned around. 2 ships, 1 crippled destroyer, and 1 corvette the size of a Noxie shuttle, turned directly into an armada of over 90 remaining raider ships, and they attacked. They did not communicate. Not once. Not a single transmission passed between the 2 ships. They moved in coordination so tight that the fleet's tactical computers flagged it as impossible without a shared command signal. There was no shared command signal. Just 2 silent ships cutting into the enemy fleet like teeth. The Achilles targeted reactor cores. Not weapons, not engines, reactors. Every shot was a kill shot, aimed at maximum destruction. It flew through Noxus formations with a recklessness that went beyond bravery into something that had no word in any language Vreth spoke. Vasquez was not trying to survive. She was not trying to hold a position. She was trying to make the Noxus pay for the Argonaut, in a currency measured in ship hulls. The Myrmex matched her. The small corvette flew patterns that its design specifications said were structurally impossible. Turns that should have torn the hull apart, accelerations that should have killed the crew. It struck ammunition stores and command bridges with a precision that suggested its crew could see the future. Or more accurately, that they no longer cared about their own future and had dedicated the remainder of it to destruction. 20 minutes in, the Myrmex's weapons went offline. It had taken too much damage. Any sane commander would have withdrawn. The Myrmex did not withdraw. It accelerated into the center of a Noxus carrier group, 3 heavy ships flying in close formation, and detonated its own drive core. The explosion consumed all 3 carriers. The Myrmex crew had evacuated into escape pods 60 seconds before detonation. Vreth tracked the pods on his sensors. They drifted in the debris field, silent, dark, and when the Coalition ships picked them up later, every surviving crew member was awake, uninjured, and quiet. The Myrmex's captain was sitting in his pod with his hands folded in his lap, eyes open, staring at nothing. The Achilles fought alone for 40 more minutes. Vreth could not look away from his console. The destroyer was bleeding atmosphere from a dozen hull breaches. Its weapons fired in irregular patterns that suggested several batteries were being operated manually. It limped and staggered and kept killing. It destroyed or disabled 14 Noxus ships in total, before the Noxus, for the first time in the engagement, for perhaps the first time in the memory of any living Noxus, pulled back. The raiders retreated from a single ship. When the Kethali rescue frigate, Whisper of Catalogs M, Vreth's own ship, docked with the Achilles, the boarding team found the ship in ruins. Power failures across every deck. Atmosphere venting in 3 sections. Fires burning in compartments that no longer had crew to fight them. On the bridge, Captain Elena Vasquez sat in her command chair. Her hands were on the controls. Blood ran from a wound on her head down the side of her face and pooled on the console. Her eyes were open. She did not react when the boarding team entered. She did not respond to her name. She did not appear to see them. The rescue team's captain, a Kethali named Vreth's commanding officer, though Vreth did not learn this detail until he reviewed the records years later, tried several times to establish contact. Vasquez stared through the team like they were furniture. Her hands stayed on the controls. Her eyes tracked something that was not in the room. The captain tried a tactical prompt. He said, "Threat eliminated. Corridor secure." Vasquez blinked. Her eyes focused. She looked at the captain. She looked at the bridge. She looked at the blood on her console, as if seeing it for the first time. "Copy," she said, "securing station." Then she passed out. The convoy escaped. All 40,000 civilians survived. The Noxus Armada was broken, and did not return to the Vithani corridor for 2 years. Vreth sat in the archive chamber and looked at the sensor logs from that day, the same logs he had watched from his console as a young officer, and he felt the same thing he had felt then, a cold, clicking vibration deep in his thorax that was the Kethali equivalent of awe mixed with fear in proportions he could not separate. He closed the file and opened the last one. The archive chamber was quiet in the way that only a Kethali archive could be. The silence of a species that believed all sounds were data, and all data deserved respect. Vreth sat surrounded by crystals that held the records of 1,000 civilizations, and he thought about noise. He had all the pieces now. Korath 7, Dr. Luentha's research, the Vithani corridor, 3 files that together told a story that the Council had decided was important enough for a black cipher and a Nova-class threat rating. Not because the story was about a weapon, not because it described a new technology or a strategic vulnerability, because it was about a sound, or the end of one. Vreth opened the final document, the directive itself, the thing he had been hired to archive and annotate, and read it through from beginning to end. Council Directive 4 Sigma 9 was 12 pages long, but its core occupied only a single page. The rest was legal framework, jurisdictional notes, and the bureaucratic scaffolding that the Council wrapped around every decision to make it look like the product of careful deliberation rather than fear. Vreth, who had archived enough Council directives to know the difference between policy and panic, recognized the signs. The legal framework had been drafted in 3 days. Normal Council legal review took 6 months. Someone had been in a hurry. The core text read, "In any joint military operation involving human forces, all Allied units must monitor human vocal communications at all times. Continuous monitoring is not optional and may not be delegated to automated systems. A living officer must be assigned to this task. If human combat vocalizations cease for a sustained period during active engagement, the following actions are to be taken immediately and without exception. All non-human Allied personnel within direct combat proximity to human units are to withdraw to a minimum safe distance of 300 meters. This withdrawal is not a retreat, it is a safety measure. Do not announce the withdrawal to the human units. Do not request acknowledgement. Simply move. Second, do not attempt to engage, redirect, or issue orders to silent human combatants. They will not respond to standard communication. They may not recognize Allied species as non-threats. Physical contact with a silent human combatant is extremely dangerous and is prohibited except by authorized human personnel. Third, notify human command authority immediately using designated emergency channels. Only human psychological operations personnel trained in re-engagement protocols are authorized to re-establish contact with silent human combatants. This is not a guideline. This is a restriction. Violation carries the same penalty as firing on Allied forces. Under no circumstances should the silence be interpreted as defeat, retreat, or loss of combat effectiveness. Assume the opposite. Silent human units are operating at maximum lethality with reduced capacity for restraint and reduced ability to distinguish Allied from hostile forces. Plan accordingly. Fifth, when human vocalizations resume, the crisis has passed. Human units may be re-engaged cooperatively. Expect disorientation, emotional volatility, and possible medical needs. Treat resumption of noise as the all-clear signal it functionally is. Vreth read the 5 points 3 times. Then he set down the crystal and did something unusual for a Cathali archivist. He stopped reading and started thinking. The directive was not what he had expected. When he first received the assignment, when he first saw the black cipher and the Nova class rating, he had assumed the document would be a contingency plan, a strategy for containing human aggression, a blueprint for what to do if humanity turned on the galactic community. Every species had such plans for every other species. It was the quiet, impolite reality of interstellar diplomacy. This was not that. This was a protection protocol, and the thing it was protecting was not the galaxy from humans. It was protecting everyone, humans included, from a specific moment. A threshold that humans could cross under sufficient pressure. A line that once crossed turned the loudest species in the galaxy into something that did not speak, and did not stop, and did not distinguish between the enemy in front of it and the ally beside it with the reliability that survival required. The humans knew about this line. They had always known. Their entire military culture, the shouting, the battle cries, the songs, the obscene creativity of their combat language, was built on that line, not to cross it. To keep the noise going, because the noise meant the human inside was still running the show. When the noise stopped, something else took over. Something that won battles at a cost that could not be measured in casualties alone. Vreth pulled up the personnel files attached to the directive supporting evidence. He wanted to know what happened to the humans who crossed the line and came back. Sergeant Mara Okonkwo retired from military service 2 years after Korath 7. The file noted she had received extensive psychological support during her transition. She moved to a colony world called New Harmony and took a job teaching music to children. Music. Vreth sat with that detail for a long time. A woman who had killed 400 enemies in 6 hours of silence now spent her days teaching small humans how to make noise. He did not know if this was irony or medicine or both. Captain Elena Vasquez spent 14 months in a rehabilitation facility following the Vithani corridor. Her file noted that she had difficulty with speech for the first 3 months. Not a physical impairment, a psychological one. She had spent so long in the silence that her mind resisted the return to language, as if noise itself had become a foreign concept. The human psychologist who treated her described her recovery as a process of rebuilding the connection between action and expression, between violence and voice, between the thing that killed and the person who had to live with the killing. She recovered. She returned to service, not in a combat role, but as the commander of a humanitarian fleet that delivered aid to systems damaged by Noxus raids. She escorted the same kind of civilian convoys she had once died to protect, except now she did it without weapons. Vreth found a note in her file from a routine psychological evaluation. The evaluator had asked Vasquez how she was doing. Vasquez had replied, "Loud. I'm doing loud. That's the goal." Vreth saved his annotations and closed the files one by one. He compiled his index, tagged his references, sealed the archive with his personal cipher alongside the black one, and logged the completion of his assignment. He was the last archivist in the chamber. The corridors of Station Aethys Prime were quiet at this hour, populated only by maintenance drones and the occasional night shift officer. Vreth gathered his materials and walked toward the exit, his forelimbs clicking softly against the polished floor. He turned a corner and nearly walked into a wall of sound. 6 human soldiers, off-duty, out of uniform, filled the corridor with a noise that had no tactical purpose and no informational content. One of them was telling a story that involved hand gestures wide enough to be a navigational hazard. Another was arguing about something. Food, Vreth thought, based on the fragments he caught, with the kind of passionate intensity that most species reserved for territorial disputes. A third was doing something on a personal device and periodically shouting numbers that made the others groan or cheer for reasons Vreth could not determine. They were loud, beautifully, pointlessly, gloriously loud. One of them, a tall male with dark skin and a smile that took up more of his face than seemed anatomically reasonable, bumped into Vreth as the group passed. The human stopped, looked down, and his expression shifted to what Vreth had learned was called apologetic, though it still looked mostly like amused. "Hey, sorry about that, little guy," the human said, and clapped Vreth on the thorax with a hand that was far too heavy, and clearly meant with complete affection. "Didn't see you there." "It is acceptable," Vreth said. The human grinned wider and rejoined his group. They moved down the corridor, their noise bouncing off the walls and filling the space with the chaotic, irrational, magnificent sound of a species that was busy being people instead of predators. Vreth stood in the corridor and listened until they turned a corner and the sound faded to an echo and the echo faded to a memory. He had spent 3 days studying what human silence meant, what it cost, what it could do. Standing alone in a quiet corridor, on a station at the edge of civilized space, Vreth understood the directive completely. Not as an archivist, as a person who had heard the silence and survived it, and would never forget what it sounded like. Human noise was not a nuisance. Human noise was the sound of a species holding itself together. The sound of 1,000,000 years of predator evolution being wrestled into submission by language and laughter and music and profanity, and the sheer stubborn insistence on being heard. Every shout was a choice. Every laugh was a victory. Every pointless argument about food in a corridor at midnight was proof that the thing in the dark was still asleep. The silence was what happened when the wrestle was lost. Vreth clicked his mandibles once, a sound of respect in Kethali culture, and walked home through the quiet station, grateful for every echo of human noise that reached him through the walls. He had never found a sound more comforting.